The inverted yield curve, what everybody is missing, and nobody's talking about this. I can't believe it. I'm going to explain it to you right now in 3 short, quick, simple steps. Step number 1, let's go through the basics. What makes the price move on a bond? It's the yield. So when the yield goes down, the price moves up. There's an inverse correlation. How does that work? Because if you buy a bond for $100, it's yielding 1%. If the rates go up to 10%, then the people that are out there in the bond market, why would they buy your bond when they can now buy a bond at 10%? So the value of your bond goes down. That's why there's an inverse relationship. So going over to the yield curve, we start here at 1968 with this example. Going to today, this is the 10-year and the 2-year spread. It goes up to a +4 here, -4 here. Every single time that yield curve inverts, meaning that the 10-year, the rate on that goes lower than the 2-year, we've got a recession that follows. This is a very rare occurrence because there's more risk associated with a 10-year bond. Therefore, the interest rate should be higher. But we go from 70, we have a recession here, 74, 80, 82. This whole time frame was basically a recession. We get it in 90, 2000, 2008, and now that yield curve has inverted again. I want to point out that the time frame, the length of these recessions since 1990 has gradually gotten bigger, and in 2008 it was much bigger. Why is that? Because there's more debt in the system. So every single time that these interest rates rise, there's more debt that can be effective, so there's a bigger negative consequence. When the yield curve inverts, it usually signals a contraction of the business cycle. Coming over here is our GDP. This is flat line. We know as the credit cycle expands, that business cycle, it goes up and then it goes down. So when that yield curve inverts, that's signaling that we're right about here going into a recession or a depression. One more thing I want to point out in step number 1 is the steepening of the yield curve. You'll notice that it's not necessarily the inversion of the yield curve which brings on that recession. That actually precedes every recession by quite a bit. It's when that yield curve starts to go back up, that's when we really have problems. Why is that? Because the Fed comes in and they try to smooth out this business cycle, ironically, by dropping interest rates low. That decreases the hurdle rate for loans, which means that there's more shaky debt in the system or more malinvestment. So when that bad debt tries to roll over, they can't do it as easily because now interest rates are higher, so they go out of business and consumer demand plummets because their monthly payments go up, but their incomes go down. Step number 2, the duration risk in the inversion of the yield curve. And this is what everyone is missing. Nobody's talking about this. It starts with time to maturity. And a lot of people conflate these two things, but that's not right. Because duration is measured in years, they think that it's the time to maturity. That's incorrect. Let's step back here and look at our typical yield curve. We're going to start at 3 months and go out to 30 years. Here's our interest rate. And normally, the interest rate gradually increases. And it increases because the longer your principal is exposed to the risks of the government, which default and inflation, the higher premium that you need to be paid to take that risk. Here's where it gets a little confusing. If we have 2 30-year bonds, so they're the identical maturity, one yields 6% and the other yields 8%, the duration risk on the bond that yields 6% is far greater than the duration risk on the bond that yields 8%. Let me explain. Of course, economists have formulas and equations to explain this duration risk. Editor, go ahead and pull that up right now. And as you can see, this would literally make your head spin. But we're not Keynesians on this channel, so we don't care about formulas and equations. The only thing we care about is good old-fashioned common sense. So using that common sense, we come over here. What it really boils down to, this duration risk, is the risk of your principal. So the maturity applies to when you're getting all your money back, so how fast or slow that is. And the interest rate applies to how fast you're getting some of your money back. So if we have 2 $100 bonds, one of them is 10-year and one of them is 5-year, and they both pay 10%, you're going to have more risk with the 10-year because that's going to be longer before you get your principal back. Down here we have two $100 bonds, both of them maturing at the same time, 10 years. This one's paying 1%, this one's paying 10%. The bond that pays you 1% is going to have much higher duration risk. That's because the bond that's paying you 10% is giving you higher interest rates. That means more money in your pocket, more principal of your original principal is being returned. The faster you get that principal back in your pocket, the faster that you get that money, even if it's a percentage of that money, the less total risk that you have. That is what we want. Oh, but wait, there is more. Now that we understand the duration risk, we can conclude that the longer the maturity and the less amount of yield that you're getting, the greater sensitivity that we have to interest rate movements. And this is pretty simple. If we have our duration years here, going back to that goofy formula, pretty much for every 1% increase in interest rates, we have a 1% decrease in number of duration years. So if we have a 30-year bond that is yielding 0%, the duration years on that is roughly 30 because we eliminate the calculation for the interest rate payment. So if interest rates go up by 1%, you would lose 30% of your principal on that zero yielding bond. If you have a 30-year bond that yields 5%, then you'd lose maybe 15% of that principal. This is not an exact calculation, but that gives you an idea of how the sensitivity to the interest rate increases or decreases goes up exponentially with the number of duration years we have. In other words, it goes up exponentially the longer maturity and the lower interest rates go. Are you starting to connect the dots? Step number 3, the inverted yield curve endgame. What I want to do now is put all the pieces of the puzzle together to give you a completely different perspective on the inversion of that yield curve. What we know is that when that curve inverts, the recession odds are very high. Also, this signals the change in the business cycle. Here are the stages of the business cycle. To explore these in a little more depth, let's check out this article from Investopedia. Expansion. This is the first stage. When expansion occurs, there is an increase in employment, incomes, production, sales, and people generally pay their debts on time. The economy has a steady flow of money supply and investment is booming. The second stage is the peak, and this is when the economy hits a snag, having reached maximum level of growth. Step number 3 is the recession, and this is where we really need to focus. These are the periods of contraction. During a recession, unemployment rates rise, production slows, sales start to drop because of a decline in demand, and incomes become stagnant or decline. 4, the depression. Economic growth continues to drop while unemployment rates rise and production plummets. Consumers and businesses find it hard to secure credit, which means consumer confidence and investment levels also drop. Step number 5 is the trough. This is the period that ends the depression, leading an economy into the next step, which is recovery. In this recovery, in this stage, the economy starts to turn around. Low prices, and I really want to emphasize that, low prices spur an increase in demand, employment and production start to rise, and lenders start to open their credit coffers. This stage marks the end of the business cycle. Did you catch that? It's the low prices and getting out all of that malinvestment that lead to the actual recovery. In other words, the cure is actually the recession and the depression. Going over here, we've got the Fed. Remember, they're always trying to smooth out this business cycle. They don't want prices to go down. This just increases malinvestment when the cure is avoided. Let's get a visual to understand this better. We've got GDP and we've got that business cycle. What the Fed does is they come in here and they want to prevent this cure from happening. This is the recession and the depression. So they come in and inject all this liquidity and quantitative easing and ZERP and all that nonsense to do whatever they can to avoid that pain. Well, what they're doing is they're just avoiding the cure. So the next time we go through this business cycle, the malinvestment grows. Well, maybe they can paper over that one too, but we get to a point where they run out of ammo and they can't prevent that recession/depression. And when we go into it, it's exponentially worse because in the past recessions, they tried to paper over the cure. So it's not just about the inverted yield curve, it's about the severity of the recession that inverted yield curve is signaling. Oh, but wait, there is more. Now it's really time to grab that stiff drink, because remember the duration risk? The lower the rates go, the bigger the price moves in the bond market. We've got two inverted yield curves here that look identical, but they're much, much different in terms of risk. This yield curve starts at 4%. So the 3-month is at 4%, going to the 30 at 3.2, where this yield curve, the 3-month is at 2%, going to the 30-year at 1.0. This yield curve, although it looks the exact same, has vastly greater risk if the increase in the interest rates are identical. So the recession that inverted yield curve is signaling is going to be much, much worse. In addition to that, the bond market, if rates steepen enough, is going to completely implode. And that is what everybody is missing about the inverted yield curve. For more information like this, check out this content right here, and I will see you on the next video.